This is AMD's FX 8350, a CPU released to the masses in October of 2012. AMD released this chip with hopes to redeem itself after the disaster that was known as Bulldozer. This updated microarchitecture named Piledriver made a number of incremental improvements over the previous design, and while it was 15% faster, it still wasn't enough to tackle Intel at the time. So let's fast forward to today, and let's face it, we live in a post-quad-core age. More and more applications and games are written to use even more threads, and you can't argue that Ryzen has changed the landscape for the better. In my opinion, there hasn't been a better time to buy a new CPU in many years. Still, the biggest issue we all face today is the cost of DDR4. And while prices are starting to drop, it's still driving many to look to the used market. And in this used market, Intel's previous generation of i5, i7, and Xeon CPUs still perform superbly in gaming. So with all that being said, where does AMD's Piledriver fit into the equation? Well, today I hope to delve a bit deeper into this. Now, it's easy to look at the 8350 when compared to better performers and say it's all around junk and it isn't a capable gaming CPU at all. I mean, it runs hot, it trips 15 amp breakers, it has the same or worse IPC compared to the Phenom 2 that came before it. So, in today's video, we're going to pair the FX 8350 with 16GB of DDR3 and a GTX 1060 6GB. And since we're not comparing it to other CPUs today, we're just going to see how well it does in current games at 1080p. And we're going to use settings that the GTX 1060 is capable of hitting 60 FPS when installed in more robust platforms. Unfortunately, we won't be doing any overclocking today, as my ASRock motherboard has an anemic 4+1 phase VRM, and while it might be able to coax a little bit more out of the CPU, I decided to test the CPU at stock speeds for today's benchmarks. Before we jump into all the delicious benchmarks, let's first take a look at today's system. Now, first up is the motherboard, and here we have the ASRock 970 Extreme 3. Now, the Extreme is a mid-range board with features you'd expect to see from the 970 chipset, and as I previously stated, the biggest handicap of this board is the weak 4+1 phase VRM. Yuck. To cool this oven-like CPU, I selected a tried-and-true Cooler Master Hyper 212, and I swapped out the stock fan for a PWM Fractal fan because the cat was having a moment with it. Next up, it's system memory time, and here we have Samsung's amazing Wonder RAM. These little guys only use 1.35 volts and are usually great little overclockers, but for today's testing I set them to 1600 MHz with a cast latency of 9. These are conservative speeds for this memory, but they better represent what most non-overclocking FX users would use in their systems. As for the storage, I chose a basic ADATA 120GB SSD for the OS and applications, and I installed all the games on a Seagate 1.5TB 7200 RPM drive. For the GPU, well, I removed the GTX 1060 from a borrowed Lenovo T730. Now, this card is made by MSI and has custom Legion badging on the basic blower design. Now, this card boosted anywhere between 1810 and 1848 MHz during all of the game testing. As for the power supply, FSP sent me their Hydro PTM 750W. It's an 80+ platinum rated power supply that is fully modular. It's outfitted with Japanese capacitors and has positive reviews across multiple respectable sites. This unit is pretty overkill for the system, but it's nice to know that power never ends. And the last part of our build is the case. And once again, FSP supplied me with their CMT 330. Now, it's a mid-tower case that gets a lot right for a case in this price point. Now, while the case comes with 2 fans, FSP also sent me 3 of their CF12S blue LED case fans so I can use at the front of the case. Now, while ventilation on this case is kind of limited, I didn't have too many issues with temps during my 2 weeks of using this PC. This case also has a plastic clear side panel, and the magnetic halo cover is removable for easy access to the PSU and cables. Building in this case was simple, and decent cable management was quite easy to achieve. Okay, now that you got a good look at today's test system, here's a list of all the components, OS, and drivers that were used for today's tests. First game up is Forza Horizon 4. We selected the Ultra preset and used the built-in benchmark to capture our numbers. We averaged 67 frames per second, and frame times were excellent during the entire run, as shown. You can see the GTX 1060 never sees full utilization during this run, but overall performance is still strong in this DX12 title. Now it's time for some Destiny 2. And we selected the highest graphics preset and captured our numbers from this portion of the single player game. It's an intensive scene, but our system has no problems ripping through it, as we saw an average of 74 frames per second. Now, frame times were also great, with only a couple small spikes here and there. Destiny 2 doesn't support an OSD, so after the run I exited out of the game to see the CPU was sitting at the 50 to 60% range, while the GPU hovered in the 80 to 90% range during much of our capture. Next we have Final Fantasy 15, and we used the high preset with no hairworks. We captured our numbers from gameplay like shown on screen. The system averaged 63 frames per second, and frame times were not that bad. There was some evidence of very slight micro stutter, but truth be told, I didn't notice it. There are some signs of frame time spikes from 60 to 80 milliseconds, but they happen so quickly it doesn't really pull you away from the game. GPU utilization stayed pegged at 98 to 99% throughout much of the test. Now here's a title that really surprised me, Assassin's Creed Origins. Now we used a very high preset and captured our numbers from gameplay in the city at the beginning of the game. We averaged 52 frames per second, and while average frame rates were not too surprising, the frame times were, because they were good. They were very good. This is one of the few games where both the CPU and GPU see very high utilization quite often. It's finally nice to see a game max out all 8 CPU threads while still maintaining solid frame latency. Speaking of solid frame latency, Bethesda's Fallout 76 is up, and yeah, those was jokes. Anyway, we maxed out the game with ultra settings and spent some time in Flatwoods to get our numbers. We did average 57 frames per second, which is actually very good. The only issue is average frame rates never tell the whole story. And while a lot of the time in our capture we did experience great frame times, and others not so much. Game-stopping stutters were present. Just look at these spikes from 250 to 500 plus milliseconds. Ouch. This kind of latency is really felt in game as shown on screen, and the CPU and possibly platform is really holding back the GTX 1060 in this title. Shadow of the Tomb Raider is next, and here we selected the highest preset and used DX12, which performs better than DX11 in this title. Now we used the in-game benchmark to capture our results, and we averaged 50 frames per second. The last part of the benchmark was very stressful on both the CPU and GPU, and frame times were solid for the most part, but during a lot of the transitions, we did see a bit of stutter and some slight hiccups towards the end of the benchmark. And while the GPU was maxed out for a lot of the benchmark, the FX platform is still holding back the GTX 1060 from performing at its best. And the next game up is, wait. Oh crap, I'm coming, Peaches. Anyway, we chose the high preset for this title, and we captured gameplay from the location you see here. We averaged 50 frames per second, and as you can see, the CPU bottleneck was real in this title. Driving felt very jittery, as you can see in the beginning of the frame time graph, and after that, frame times were just not half bad. A lot of FPS variability was present, but the game was still plenty playable, just not optimal. Fortnite, everybody loves Fortnite. Well, maybe not everybody. But I did test this game using the Epic preset and captured gameplay from Tilted Towers. I averaged 81 frames per second and experienced solid frame times with the exception of one spike. I also tested this game with the shadows off and AA turned off, and that resulted in 117 frames per second during the same run. This game is plenty easy for this system, but it does get a lot more demanding once areas become more dense and highly populated. And the last game in our test suite is Battlefield 5. Now we did test both the single player and multiplayer portion of the game, and we did choose DX11 using the Ultra preset along with future frame rendering. For the single player test, we selected the 1944 province mission and captured most of that first area. Now we averaged 61 frames per second, and frame times are actually very good. The game played a lot better than I thought it would, and CPU and GPU usage remained high for the majority of the capture. For the multiplayer testing, we chose Rotterdam, as it's a pretty CPU intensive map compared to some of the others. Now I captured over 20 minutes of gameplay and I averaged 62 frames per second, which is pretty dang impressive. We did have a lot more frame time issues here, as stutters could certainly be felt here and there, but overall the game was still very playable in my opinion. The CPU did jump up to 100% usage in some areas, and the GPU usage hovered in the 80 to 90% range much of the time. I didn't test any synthetic benchmarks this go round. I'll have to do that in a follow-up video when I throw overclocking into the mix. Anyhow, I did measure power consumption while playing Assassin's Creed Origins, and both the CPU and GPU were being pushed into the high 90% range. You can see the power consumption is less than 300 watts at the wall, and actual system consumption is less when factoring in PSU efficiency. Power consumption isn't that high when running the CPU at stock speeds, but that all goes out the window once you start pushing the volts and the frequency. Alright, so bringing this video to a close, what are my impressions at this point? Well, I did spend 2 weeks using this system as my main gaming PC, and to be completely honest, I'm surprised. I didn't expect a stock FX 8350 to perform as well as it did in these modern titles at 1080p. Now you can really see the CPU starts to spread its wings in some of these newer titles that can take advantage of up to 8 threads or maybe even more. Of course, not every game is great. There are a lot of games that perform less than stellar when using this CPU, and while the FX did surprise me, it's certainly not the pinnacle of CPU processing. Now, would I recommend someone to go out and buy a used AM3 motherboard and this CPU? No, it doesn't really make sense when you can find a better i7 or a Xeon for not a whole lot more. Or you can just save up a little bit more money and maybe buy a Ryzen 7 1600 or similar. Of course, there's always a deal to be found, so you can use your best judgment. So, what if you're currently rocking an 8-core Vishera? Does that mean you need to add a GTX 1080 Ti to your shopping cart? Absolutely not. In fact, for 1080p, I think the GTX 1060 or RX 580 are probably where you should stop as far as GPUs go. Even though we did see the 1060 in some games reach 99% utilization, that doesn't mean the GTX 1060 was able to perform as best as it could. You might be able to make the case for a faster GPU at 1440p or 4K, but if you want to push high refresh rates at 1440p, you're still going to need a more capable gaming CPU. In short, the FX 8350 and platform are still holding the GTX 1060 back. It's been quite a while since I last used an AMD FX 8350, and I can now see why a lot of current users are still content with its performance. Now, I do realize the CPU is certainly not going to pacify everyone, but there are a lot of FX 8350 users out there that just don't have the funds to do a full platform upgrade. So as you can see, if you're playing these current games, it still gets the job done. I do plan on spending more time with this CPU, and hopefully I can procure a better motherboard and maybe a 6-core Phenom 2 to compare it to. It would also be interesting to see how well an older i5 Sandy or Ivy Bridge CPU compares to it in these modern titles. If you want to see something like that in the future, then please check out my Amazon and Humble Bundle affiliate links found in the video's description. Using any of these will help fund new parts to showcase and test on the channel. Also, big shout out to my friend Randy for donating all of the AMD goods, and thank you to FSP for supplying the case and power supply for this video. Alright, well that's it people. Please subscribe if you want to see more content like this, and hit that notification bell to get notified on my upcoming videos. And as always, thanks for taking the time to watch the video.